Tonight we're going to hear from three of the brightest people I've ever met. One, let me start with our local talent first. Dr. Esteban Rael-Galvez is a native son of New Mexico, former SAR resident scholar, former SAR board member, and then he's also had some other minor roles like New Mexico State Historian, Senior VP of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and so on. A very talented young man who is currently a principal of an organization called Creative Strategies 360, which is a consulting firm focused on fostering community and inspiring creativity. So Esteban will be running the show as soon as I step down from the podium. Fred Dust is a global managing director of the international design firm IDEO, a design team with 9 locations in North America, Asia, and Europe. I encourage you to look at their website. It's dazzling, really fascinating, exactly what you'd expect from that level of interest, intelligence, and creativity. Originally trained as an architect, Dust's recent work focuses on helping organizations, philanthropic, governmental, entrepreneurial, work together to maximize their social impact. And joining Fred today is David Young, who's worked on enterprise design projects for Ford, BMW, Hewlett Packard, and Microsoft, some small firms that you might be familiar with, as well as cultural institutions such as the Museum of Modern Art and the J. Paul Getty Museum. David's currently a lecturer at the Parsons School of Design at the New School University in New York City. So I give you our 3 talented individuals, and let's just go.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yes? Great. Good afternoon, good evening, Pupuave. My name is Esteban, and I'm so honored to be here this evening, not just because of Susan, SAR, seeing old friends, making new friends. We had a lovely lunch today. If we could have just captured that moment and filmed it, we're going to try to replicate it a little bit here. We're trying to pretend like this is a living room setting and we're going to have a conversation. We used to do something at the Philip Johnson Glass House, Conversations in Context. We're placing our conversation in the context of this city, our state, our organizations. We're thinking about what it means to design not just equitable cities, but livable cities, right? And we're thinking about what it means to just have a basic conversation. But I was always taught to begin the same way. You always begin recognizing the land upon which we stand today, particularly the Tewa people who have long served from the moment of origin to the present moment, being stewards of this land. I think of one of my dearest friends, Rena Swensel, who always said, wherever we go, we leave our breath behind us. An invocation not just about those ancestors that we walk into the spaces where they've left their own breath, but a reminder to us that it's our responsibility for what we leave behind as well. Not only our thoughts and our deeds and our words, but what we leave for the next 7 generations as well. So honoring that land. Before we jump into the conversation, as I was preparing for this evening, I thought of 2 quick frames of reference, markers or metaphors for what we'll be talking about. In northern New Mexico, which is why I have this image here, elders have long identified a concept that they call La Resolana. Imagine a porch or the south side of a building, shielded from the wind, but bathed and illuminated in the rays of the sun. What makes this place dynamic, La Resolana, is it's always gathered men and women who are carefully articulating observations of their contemporary life, what it means to live in the village, in this particular moment, 1943 in Mora, New Mexico, but also relating the memory and wisdom that came before them and thinking about their own grandchildren living in the world, particularly at a very difficult moment, not just for Mora, but for the nation as a whole. So La Resolana is something, it's about an open dialogue. It's precisely what we're having today. I wish I had my cane because I like that little old man up there. I also thought of a story some years ago, particularly it was at a SAR gathering. Maybe some of you were there. Another dear friend, Linda Cordell, stood before some of us. And she held a bowl. So I'm supposed to flip this. Not this bowl, but another bowl. She stood before us and held a bowl of another woman in Pecos Pueblo who held a bowl from the 12th century. Not very far from here, she invited our imagination into the conversation and asked us to gather around what meaning that bowl held for the community, not just at that particular moment, but to us even standing around the bowl. Around that vessel, we imagined a woman born into this sovereign, already sovereign, and even then, an ancient landscape, and what it could have meant in the 12th century to that woman. What she held in that bowl, that single utilitarian ceramic pot, what it was, the ceramic pot, how it was used, that was found buried in one place and actually revealed elements of many other places. The clay, the design, the pigment, the glaze, perhaps those things that were carried in the bowl as well, macaw feathers, shells that came from other places, but also prefacing the local, the corn that came from that very place. In that gesture of holding the bowl, it conveyed also protection. How she held it could have conveyed to others who saw her holding it profound connection and communication. That single vessel might have also communicated an intricate, deeply advanced web of relations, not just in her own community, but in the entire region. I often think of that bowl when I think of my own work, and certainly as I was thinking of David and Fred's work, to strengthen community, to foster a sense of creativity, and to heighten our consciousness, not just of the past, but what those meanings and metaphors hold for the present. I believe that our work is always influenced by stories like this and metaphors that guide us to make the world a better place than what we have inherited. Fred.
I actually thought I had about 10 more minutes.
That was my transition. So I'm drawn to what you said recently, that at IDEO you were looking to design practices of the past, seeing how they might work for us in the future. You talk about looking at tradition. So I've talked a little bit about tradition. I assume like the one that I began, maybe, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, certainly, for how to design time for in-depth dialogue and conversations. Talk to us a little bit more about what you were talking about there in terms of traditions.
Yeah, and actually what I was talking about then and what I'm still talking about, I have to be honest, I've been, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the work I've done to date has been in the public sector, lots of work with cultural institutions, lots of work with government. And really what I realized was when you're working with multi-sectoral conversations, the first thing you have to work on designing is actually dialogue itself. And dialogue is the thing that actually keeps us from making the progress that we need. And I would say, regardless of where we stand right now, we're in a kind of critical crisis around dialogue in this country, and I think around the world. And so one of the things that I did earlier in the year, and you were with me and had to listen to me talk about this for a long time, is basically start to look back at moments where we've historically designed dialogue. Because the reality is, it's one of the first things, it's the first medium we've been designing in, is the way we talk to each other as people. And we've been doing it for 6,000 years, way longer, the moment we could talk. And so the reality is that there's a lot to learn from historically the ways that we've designed dialogue to bring forward. And I'll just give you one or two examples, because I think it's helpful. Does everybody know the origin of the word of symposium, where that comes from? There's got to be people in this room, right? So it's like
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. It's like we can see. So it
One.
comes from.
They're being
great.
polite.
Yeah. So great. It comes from. It's like a dinner party. That's right. It comes from this thing called a simpa, which is actually the wine vessel. And the simpa was also the person who poured the wine. And so, 6,000 years ago, when they wanted to have really serious philosophical conversations, they would bring people together and they would kind of recline like this, like in this thing, with wine, which they didn't allow us to have. And basically, so we try to get in here. But basically, they would use that wine to tune the way the dialogue would happen. So, if Esteban was, getting really, a little sloppy, they would kind of tune down the wine drinking, make us, drink more. We'd talk more. And it was a way to kind of build equanimity in the conversation. And so that's actually a designed format. And frankly, that's not really what symposiums are like now, if you go to them. Maybe at 11 o'clock by the pool, but that's not actually what you want to think about that. But these are actually examples that we can be using. My favorite simple example is the Japanese tea house was designed to keep shogun warriors from coming in with their armor. So basically, it literally de-armed them before they would go into conversation over tea. So these are formats that were built to actually think about how we could dialogue in new and different ways. And they're things I think we've forgotten that we can actually bring into the formats that we have today.
Yeah. Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
I think that this notion of how do we have dialogue is critical, right? And I think the way that you began this with the vessel, the bowl, the object, that's the place today where we're struggling. After you mentioned that you had somebody talk about autonomous vehicles. For years, I worked on sort of future mobility projects, and one of the things that defined us, especially Americans, for a generation was the car that we owned. And as we move towards autonomous vehicles and we don't own a vehicle anymore, suddenly we don't have that thing that has all of this sort of meaning imbibed in it. Right. And so we need to kind of reinvent what that is. And then even more radically is the way that we deal with digital content. And we think of all of our content on our phone, our memories, our photos, our communications, but the phone itself, we kind of enjoy it when it gets scratched a little bit, but if it takes on too much of a patina, we throw it away. All of the content is really in the cloud. And so we're moving towards this moment of there is no object, or we have to redefine what that object is, or how can we have these conversations in ways that may be less object-based.
Well, and it's actually interesting because I think that's a great example where also the object, and I think the bowl might do it, frankly this room does it, the object defines the way we have dialogue. Can you go back to the photo of the four men on the porch? So what's interesting about this is that I'm curious, does anyone want to guess, but supposedly, research says that there's one place that's the best place to talk to your kids about sex. Like sex ed. Who said car? Yeah. That's right. So, and why do we think that is? Why the car?
No eye contact.
No eye contact, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's what's interesting about this as a thing, which is that we know we get different kinds of conversations in side-by-side dialogue than if we sit like this. Or if we asked you to turn your back and lie like here, we'd have a different kind of dialogue, right? You wouldn't tell us all your secrets, but that's what therapy is based on. So, the reality is that these things set scripts for the ways we have dialogue. And when you start to think about losing cars or losing car time, you lose a certain kind of dialogue. So these things are affecting us left and right. And we're just letting new scripts come in and losing old scripts.
Right. So I wanted to go to this photo. Also the rituals, right? So this is in San Ildefonso Pueblo, and I think the Abeta family, who is gathered around shucking corn. So like the type of rituals that gather us, that sort of old traditions. So I remember sitting there with my grandmother, not just shucking corn, but also separating beans, cleaning the beans. And in those moments, particularly around the kitchen table or outside in settings like this, creating those moments for the encounter. So David, you actually wrote about one of your inspirations in terms of creating encounters. Could you say a little bit more about that, Muriel Cooper?
Right.
Who wrote
I'm trying to think of how to come to this, because as you talked about this also made me think of something.
Go ahead and say that.
And then come back. So I think what's fascinating about this is that there's also a kind of boredom involved in this activity, right? You're repetitively doing something. You're kind of doing it mindlessly. You're also getting into a kind of a flow state where time sort of disappears and you're just involved in what you're doing. And those sort of activities, which are so amazing, today are increasingly difficult to create. You know, it used to be that, you know, if you're having a fantastic conversation, you sort of lose track of the world around you. If you are performing an instrument or playing the piano or something like that, you again lose track of time. But you know, we're also seeing. I mean, I'm a technology-based person, and I'm still a kind of a cheerleader for technology, but one that's become more wary. And we're seeing that having devices around us, just the fact that a phone is on the table, completely destroys our ability to kind of go into a flow state, because we know that at any moment that thing that's on the table might wake up and interrupt us.
And this is interesting because I think now when we think of mindless, we're probably thinking about our device, right? So it's like that's
different.
And this is actually, I would say, a mindful activity.
I was
Yeah.
saying,
right? You know,
totally mindful.
It sort of reminds me of, I'm trying to think of a contemporary equivalent, which was like, well, shucking beans, or I don't know, that's maybe not contemporary. I don't know who's shucked beans anymore. I know I haven't actually I never have. It's like,
That's what we should have done.
we should have shucked beans. But like doing a puzzle, for instance, which is like sort of a mindful thing. It keeps you in the present, but slightly removed, and lets you have a different kind of dialogue. And the problem is now that the reality is we mercifully don't have our phones on us, that when we're grappling with mindful, mindless activities, it's us and our screens right now, which destroys the ability to have that kind of dialogue.
No, and I can go back to your question, which was, you know, my origins with doing design and with technology was, you know, in the 80s and 90s when new media was first beginning, and there was a sense that we use the technology as a way to explore content, and to kind of, through interrogation and through dialogue with the screens and our devices, we begin to kind of understand information in a richer way. We're not just being presented with something. And sort of over time, we have, as a society, kind of chosen that we want our information presented to us as quickly and efficiently and as sort of friction-free as possible. So we ask a question to Alexa or to Siri, and we get one answer back, as opposed to a giant screen full of answers. And so that's reduced our ability to have conversations with information as well as with each other, because we expect the same sort of response from each other that we're expecting now that we get automatically from our digital devices.
Yeah, we don't want complex responses, frankly.
Right.
Like we work to not have them in our lives. Can I observe something else?
Please, keep going.
Sorry, I know there's a senator in the House, but it's I have to tell the story about, we did work with Elizabeth Warren when she started CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and it was interesting. So, but no matter what you think of it, I mean, it was a really interesting moment historically to be at the beginning of sort of a bureau's founding. And one of the things that was interesting is that for the 2 years that we worked with them, they were a remarkably non-hierarchical organization. And Elizabeth Warren has a lot of strong opinions, but was really willing to defer to her staff. And one of the reasons, I believe, is that when they were given a place to work, they were given offices and everything, but they weren't given conference tables or chairs. And so all significant strategy conversations happen sitting cross-legged on the ground, which I actually think shifted, frankly, the way that culture worked for the first couple of years. And they eventually, somebody gave them chairs and tables eventually. So it's like, it's like, you know, at some point, Elizabeth Warren's going to be mad about that, but it was like, you know, like 4 weeks later. But I think the fact that they were setting, you know, founding strategies, sitting more like this, more as equals, that actually really set the way the culture played out. So I mean, there's really tacit things that set the way we have dialogue.
Absolutely.
Well, you already went there, but that was my next question. So we've talked a little bit about how you talk to your kids about sex, how you interact, particularly in a family setting. But you've both worked with companies to actually think about this, right? So I was thinking, just as you were saying what you were saying, Fred, that when I was at the National Trust, we actually did a major move from our old headquarters into a new headquarters, and redesigning what that space looked like was so interesting. So tell us about some of your experiences in thinking about space and the politics of space.
I think, I mean,
Well, so I mean, this is fundamentally a political space. So it's like we may try to be breaking down the way we're having a conversation with you, but the reality is the three of us are sitting up here in the light, and I don't know how many of you are sitting out there in the dark. So we're actually living by a script that's been established by the way we've set up this space. And I actually think one of the things that I've been working on recently is just trying to get us to recognize how often the spaces we're in, or the tools that are around us, or the things that are on the table, or whatever, are setting the scripts for the ways we have conversation. So I'll give you a quick example. I'm gonna ask you to throw it out, but I do this a lot. If I say the word board meeting, does anyone want to tell me quickly what the room looks like? Boring conference room. Sometimes you'll hear mahogany tables. Sometimes you'll hear big ovals. If I say the phrase AA meeting, what do you think? Circle, chair. Sometimes people will say church basement. Sometimes basement comes up a lot. The reality is that we both build that as an archetype, but when we actually are in those spaces, we live certain kind of models as well. And so one of the things I really grapple with is the fact that spaces set up scripts. You walked us. Do you want to talk about walking us out to the town square? I'd love you to tell the story.
So these two guys are only here for about 24 hours, and I was
Which
like,
we'll never
oh my
do
gosh,
again, we
you need
promise,
to see more space. But so very quickly, when we came in for a time check earlier, a sound check, I wanted them, because I'm going to ask a question in a little bit about historic trauma and monuments and memory. We're jumping ahead, but that's okay. But I wanted them to actually walk in front of the Palace of the Governors. I see this building that we're behind it, obviously. It's a site of tremendous violence. It's a marker in many ways of colonialism. But I've begun working with sites of consciousness for many years now, or begun and have for a few years. But I also see this as a site not just of consciousness, but of healing. And we have to imagine that. So I took them out, not only to see the front of the Palace of the Governors, but to see the obelisk at the center of the plaza, to frame a little bit, because I needed them to see that in order to have the conversation that we're going to have.
Yeah, I guess that was the point, is that that space we were starting to talk about, it has a certain kind of script, or some scripts that are, or things that are prompting scripts. But you started to sort of say there are so many different more ways you could be using this space to have really different kinds of conversations if we want to begin to think about how to design them. And that was what's exciting about, and we already had some ideas being out there on the plaza about different kinds of dialogue you can have in that kind of space, which is really powerful.
But talk about some of those things, because we immediately recognize it's something that I've already proposed to this museum, to actually talk about creative tensions in those very public spaces. So Fred, could you say a little bit more about what you're doing at IDEO?
Yeah, and maybe I'll sort of say that one of the things when we were having lunch together is that I think all three of us agreed that, well, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like we all agreed that the notion that one of the ways for us to move forward collectively is to embrace the fact that there are tensions, and that tensions are just there. That's we don't have to solve them. We have to live with the fact that there are tensions, and we have to kind of get through them. One of the things that we've done at IDEO is build sort of what we consider a remedy to a debate model, which is very easy at this moment to think of as it's polemic. It works best when people have alternate, quite different perspectives and fight it out. Interestingly, historically, just so you know, the rise of debate and the downfall of duels happened almost at the same historical moment. So just interesting to note, 1840s, the duels disappeared and debate became the primary form of conversation. But we wanted to break that, and we created this thing called creative tensions. And the whole notion of it is having people, instead placing out tensions in the room, things that so one is, my values are set by my demographic, or by my community, something like that. And the reality is, you can kind of go back and forth and say, I build my people around me based on my values. But then other people can be like, well, actually, no, my demographic and how I was raised set my values, and it sets the way I think. And those tensions become ways for people to have dialogue about tough issues and not solve them, but let them live in the room in a really different way. So it's mobile, so you move back and forth. You've been in like many of them. And the whole point is to get people to have conversations about tough issues and recognize that it's okay to have tension without necessarily always solving it, but beginning to have empathy for the way people engage, which we thought would be a great thing to do.
Right on the plaza.
Right on the plaza, I think. So.
Right.
And I mean, you're living in a situation where, to your point around technology, people are trying not to have tension.
Well, no, I think the question around tension and conversation is a great question, because it's how do you have those conversations in different spaces? And your question originally was, how do you create spaces, or how do you deal with space, or design for space?
Right.
And one of the other things that's happening in parallel is this there's a lot of overlaying of space. So space may mean one thing to one group, it may mean another thing to another. And at the same time, as we are more digital, as we are always connected to each other through our social media, through our texting, through our TV broadcasts, we as a community are kind of all emotionally in sync all the time. There's this sort of separation of each other that has become increasingly rare because we are so interconnected. And so the notion of space has changed because, in a way, I'm in a place, but I'm more connected to my social kind of world, whatever that might be, and feeling their emotions than I am to the space that I'm in at that moment. And so as you think about space and you think about designing space, how do you allow people to kind of break out of that sort of speed and interconnectedness from their devices or from technology to have a pause and to kind of be in the moment instead of being in this kind of constant acceleration that they're in?
Yeah, I mean, it kills me because I think as designers and creative people, I think that we look to be inspired by the world by looking at the world around us. And we moved to New York 7 years ago, and I think there's a few people who live in New York here, and I've never seen a city that tries so hard to tune out the world around them. I mean, it's interesting. What's funny is if you look now, you'll see people walking down the street looking at their devices. But if you looked 20 years ago, you saw people walking down the street reading paperback books. I mean, it's like people just desperately want to tune the place out. And it's sort of this unfortunate thing that we can do that so much more seamlessly and connect to another world as opposed to the world that we're in.
Absolutely.
It's problematic.
Yes.
Going back to your question about this, and I think to your point around space, is that we did some work with Knight Foundation looking at cities and civic spaces, and we had this really interesting situation with a set of trees in one of their cities in a southern town, and the fact that nobody could agree on whether they actually wanted to kind of build a civic space around these trees in town or not. And what we realized very quickly, just from kind of going out and having conversations much like you have here, is that they meant two different things. For the white population, they were beautiful trees. For the African American population, they were sites of hangings years and years back. And so there was no way that the trees meant the same thing. And one of the things I think we have to do is recognize that's the tension. That what's the name of the space, the building?
The Palace of the Governors.
Right. That space has 10 different meanings in it. So when we try to essentialize it to one, or 20 or 1,000, we lose the fact that it's not that simple. It doesn't just represent violence. It doesn't just now represent, merchandise, and something. It means different things for different people at different moments. And we have to hold that nuance, I think, in our minds. And that's hard.
Yeah, and it's allowing these different conversations to happen without there having to be a single right answer to it.
So when we're having those conversations, it's about holding that space. I often use that term, right? And that's difficult, right? So can you talk a little bit more about how you navigate, how you advise your clients, whether it's corporate clients, classroom, whatever it is, to be able to navigate these very difficult types of conversations?
It's hard.
Yeah, I'd say it honestly. It's like, I think the first thing is saying it's difficult. And I think the first thing for us is recognizing that going into hard dialogue is hard and takes bravery, right? That we actually need to put ourselves into a place of kind of being able to be brave and being willing to kind of have that sort of friction. And that's, I think, a lot of where your work is that recognizing that people would prefer not to and choose not to.
Yeah, I mean, people don't want to have conversations. They want answers, or they want something simpler. And I think also organizers are scared of the ambiguity or the uncertainty that emerges from loose conversations. So if somebody says, let's design the solution to this space, it's almost as if they're asking for a single story or a single way that people should experience it.
Alexa and Siri actually were going to be on the stage with us tonight because they actually have the answers.
But they're terrible, terrible.
They're awful.
Because they had the answers.
Yeah. But I think even the framing of the brief or the assignment needs to be rethought. So instead of saying we need to solve what this is, we instead need to say this needs to be a space where conversations can happen, and we don't know what the output of those conversations is going to be. It could be messy, it could be violent, maybe. But
Right.
it's only through sort of people being emotive and sympathetic and empathetic with each other that real answers can emerge from that process.
Yeah, one thing that we talk about a lot that I think will resonate with the work that you do is that, and this is going to sound super foundational, but we believe and we feel like we have to spend time with our clients and everyone we work with and frankly we have to do it to remind IDEO to do it, is that the fundamental most creative act is actually listening. That listening is in fact a creative act. And we don't think of it that way. In fact, one of the things that's funny about listening is we're taught, if you think about a classroom, again, an image that comes to mind often is kids raising their hands. And one of the things that's interesting to me about that is that's actually teaching us to learn to basically wait to talk, not to listen, right? So it's like, so basically raising your hand is kind of waiting to talk. And I think the notion that listening is this really active and creative act is something we have to relearn to even get into the kinds of dialogues that we need to be having. So yeah.
And David, you actually talk about design principles, and you've already started to talk about some of those design principles that could actually impact how we not just how we have conversations, but how we navigate through these conversations. Can you just identify one or two of those and talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I think about principles, and this is sort of some recent work that I've been doing, it's been around emerging technologies and finding ways to have more diversity of people that are helping shape what emerging technologies become. So specifically things like artificial intelligence or autonomous vehicles, that we don't want to just be given these things, given in quotes from Silicon Valley, but we want sort of all people, regardless of their technical skills, their technical competency, to have some intuition for what these things enable. And also to be able to have a voice in shaping what they want them to be in their lives. And so how do we allow more diversity to have real conversations about what our futures are together? And so part of that, again, is this notion of diversity. Part of it is removing these kinds of disciplines or other kind of academic barriers that we put up to say, well, you're not an expert in this field, so I don't want to talk to you about that because I only want experts. And the challenge is there is no such thing as an expert in some of these fields because they're brand new.
Right.
And so, how do we allow the kind of dialogue and conversation across disciplines in a kind of, whether it's cross-disciplinary or even anti-disciplinary way, to allow new ideas to emerge and sort of new possibilities for the future to emerge?
I have a follow-up question. In terms of artificial intelligence, and we were talking about this a little bit today, I mean, there are disruptions, it shifts a paradigm, I think there are good and bad consequences, but in terms of how we are thinking about how the world could change, but how do we bring ethics into the conversation of those new technological shifts?
I mean, it's a fantastic question, and there's almost an infinite number of ways to do that. So we have the kind of big five companies what an editor at the New York Times calls the Frightful Five. So this is like Facebook and Google that really control everything. And so you could say, well, I think the way to deal with ethics is to do it more in a top-down way. And so to join those companies and be sort of a part of an ethical voice within them. And that's a hard job to do because you're pushing against a giant beast of a company.
In fact, I think the Google ethics officers never last more than 6 months in their job. I mean, it's like, I think they just like, there's always a new one. But it's like, anyway, so go ahead. So
Interesting.
And another approach is maybe a more bottom-up approach, which is really just community engagement and getting people sort of in individual groups to kind of understand what's possible and sort of find some way for this grassroots voice to begin to have an impact. And then there's other approaches which are more, whether it's more academic, through academic organizations. And I think academic organizations in collaboration with cultural institutions may actually have the biggest power. Because it's one thing to try to hit a company on the head and say, don't do this or do this differently. Why are they going to do it differently? Their business model isn't there to listen to you. But if you can change the cultural imagination through art or through movies or through the way the sort of the more mainstream public thinks about it, that can act as a kind of a viral impact in the companies that are making the new technology.
Right, so both of you have actually talked a lot about design principles and how you integrate them into basic conversations across a broad range. But what would you say to your critics who might talk about design principles assume a level playing field, right? Can you speak more about that issue?
It's funny because it's a hard thing, and frankly, as I've been grappling with the notion of designing dialogue, one of the things that I've sort of put in front of me is that actually assumes agency, right? That we actually believe that we can go into a dialogue and we can succeed in that conversation, and we can begin to think about that. And the reality is that that's not the case, and there's a lot of things that set us up to not succeed in dialogue, and that's not equally distributed. And so there are deep inequities in the ways that play, and that's where I think, frankly, principles matter more. So if you think about principles, one of the things I talk a lot about is just like talking normal. So let's not even call them principles. Let's just call them rules, right? Which is just like, a principle is basically like, it's a rule that we live by. Those rules can help people succeed who wouldn't succeed otherwise in a conversation, who couldn't get into a conversation. So I'll give you, that's a great example, actually, which is that one of the principles we use is talk normal. Because we believe that when experts use expert language, they immediately cut out all the people who don't understand that language. And by the way, I was an architect. I was trained to do that. So we used to call doors interventions. Like who's supposed to know what an intervention is? I'm like, oh, that's great. It's an intervention. Don't worry about it. It's it's a door. But so
close that bathroom intervention.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you've got a lot of interventions on this side of the house. But that whole language, frankly, is meant. Another place this happens is healthcare. Like doctors and nurses and like have a special language to talk to each other that talks to everybody but the patient. And that's great because we want doctors and nurses to be able to communicate way fast, but we also want the patient to understand. And what you do accidentally when you speak in this expert language is you accidentally cut out the power base of people. So a patient doesn't feel comfortable fighting back against expert language because they don't have the language to speak to. And that happens all the time. It happens in, I would guess, meetings you're in every day with experts that you bring in. It happens in board meetings. It happens in politics. It happens in public conversations. A lot of conversations right now on gun violence are the fact that it's like people don't know how to talk about guns. It's like, so the reality is it lives everywhere, and that sets up significant inequities. So back to your simple question, a principle there, talk normal, can set the foundation for a different kind of dialogue if we decide to kind of agree to that. So I think they're one of the most powerful tools we have to set more equal footing for the way we have conversations.
It's hard, right? I mean, when you go back to this notion of expert language, the other reason that we have expert language is speed.
Efficiency,
right? And doctors have to use expert language because they have to churn through so many patients an hour, otherwise they're not going to make their numbers, or the insurance won't pay them, or whatever it is. And that's a general cultural condition that we're in today. And so the thing of like removing expert language or slowing down the conversation, to your point, like, is this you didn't say elitist, but what was the word that you used?
It assumes a level playing field.
Right.
A lot of, in terms of how we've been talking about this. I mean, I think even the conversations that we had in this city, and we continue to have, I mean, the city has been having these conversations for a long time. How do you place equity at the center of the conversation? Yeah. When the reality is that if you're not at the table, as someone often said, you're on the menu, sort of, so to speak, right?
Clearly, we're getting ready for dinner tonight. So
not everyone.
You have a lot of hungry people.
Not everyone is actually at the table who actually is being impacted by these issues of gentrification, or I think of the Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all of these movements. And yet, in terms of the real political base or power base, where the policy base, that those lives aren't, their voices are not at the table.
No, and I think I might, and forgive me because I think I might have told you this story earlier, but one of the more eye-opening moments I had was doing a cultural lecture series in New Zealand at the equivalent of their Smithsonian, which are so they're basically the Smithsonian museums, and they're all across the country. And one of the things that's really interesting is that because so much in New Zealand has been a navigation between Maori and English settlers and the way things play out, the Smithsonian there is called Te Papa. And I don't know if people know what Te Papa means, but it means our place. And what's interesting, so just stop for a moment and think about whether you called your museums our place. Like, that pretty much shifts the way you think about what happens in that space, right? And by the way, those are the first spaces in their cities that got Wi-Fi. They're like the first spaces, I think I was saying, when Christchurch had their earthquake, they fixed the museum first because it's like they're our place. And so I think this is where simple things like language set up the way, I'll tell you, I'm scared to go into the Smithsonian. That sounds scary to me. It's like it's not my place. It's like, but if a simple shift in language could set a really different dynamic into the ways that you think about things.
Right. I think your notion about the table is also interesting because a lot of people may not even realize there is a table. They don't realize that these decisions are being made that impact them in some way. And there's a lot of different ways in which we don't realize the degree to which we are powerless or have limited power in the world around us. And whether that's through the meetings with our government, or whether it's through the algorithms that drive Facebook and what posts we are shown or recommendations are presented to us. If we don't realize that those algorithms are biasing the sort of information that we get, or that we don't realize that there's a meeting that we're not invited to, then we're powerless to begin with. And so a lot of this is, I believe, a kind of more grassroots, like educate people to let them realize that these things impact their lives. And I think it's through that awareness that then they can choose how they want to act.
Yeah, and I keep wanting to push on like just how simple that can be. And so we were walking around today, and when I said we would never come here for 24 hours again, it didn't mean we would never come back. We were just like, we would never come back and spend only 24 hours. We're like, how stupid are we? But I don't know how many museums you have, like 30? No, I don't. It's like literally, there's quite a few museums within a short period of time, a short kind of space. And think about just what it means for us as just people who are visiting to decipher what those different museums showed. To be honest, it wasn't clear to us which museum we'd go to for what if we had 30 minutes to see what, and maybe we're just not in tune to that. But I think it's an interesting thing where language really throws us off. My favorite example of this is when we work in healthcare. Going back to this kind of simple language thing, often to get through emergency rooms, you need a thing called, how are we on time? Good? Okay, cool. You need to go through a thing called triage. And one of the things that we've learned in our work is that when you poll people in an emergency room, about 50% of the people know what triage meant. So what that means is 50% of the people don't, yes. Right? And so that means they're immediately set into a place where they can't come to the table. They can't, because they don't even know where what that means. And that's really problematic, I think, for us.
David, we were talking earlier about teens, and I was reflecting a little bit. I grew up as a country boy, rural community. New Mexico is very much a mix of rural and urban. And so I was having a conversation with my favorite media arts department in the state, Highlands University. And that the chair was talking about the fact that one of her graduate students, was out collecting videos from rural teens talking about technology. Mm-hmm. And so you've thought about rural teens, urban teens, and how technology plays into like how they envision the future. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. This is sort of my passion thing right now, after working for bigger and bigger companies and feeling less and less powerful to make an impact there. I said I want to start doing more grassroots work. And we have a farm in a rural area of upstate New York, and it feels like this is an ideal community to kind of help people, especially young people, understand there's new technology kind of emerging, that they can have some, whether it's a power to impact it, would be fantastic, but even the first step is a power to understand what it is and not be intimidated by it. And so I think the value of that is that a lot of these teens and even adults in these rural areas feel so disconnected from the big city. They feel that their lives are around farming, that they don't really have any opportunities, and by a certain amount of education, I believe that we can imagine new applications of the technology and new ways it can impact them. The challenge that I've had in just starting some of this stuff is that the infrastructure isn't there. And so the internet speeds we have are really slow. The internet breaks every hour or two, so we don't have regular connection. Our cell phone service barely exists. I mean, we have acres and acres, but there's only a couple spots and corners that if you're holding your phone in just the right angle, you can maybe get a signal. And so to do activities, I mean, I want to do activities in the beginning that are more playful and fun and creative as opposed to educational, but ideally there's an educational component to it. But the challenge has been, how do you create these sorts of experiences without some of the infrastructure that is necessary for that technology? And so that's through a kind of, a little bit of faking it and a little bit of simulation, but also helping people realize that they need to have a voice and saying we need more in our community.
I mean, I think you brought the question up about ethics, and I think this kills us, and we were even having this conversation a little bit over cocktails before, which is that if we're thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence and the new algorithms that will set the way that we live our lives, no bandwidth in rural communities, that's a significant issue. Boom, they're out. Like they're not set into the algorithms that we live by. And so it's just, I mean, for us it was just shocking. We're like, we couldn't even get the basics.
I mean, these could be the next coal towns, right?
Sure.
There's nothing there to support them existing in the modern world. And so, this is a general problem that we have right now, that's sort of have and have-nots. And how to, having is not necessarily the solution, because what we have has caused a lot of problems. But you have to be at that table, and you have to be educated about it and have some part in that conversation.
So as we're wrapping up, one of the things I loved reading about both of your work is where the inspiration comes from and how you start to channel that inspiration to actually imagine things like equity. I mean, so we are living, as you said at the very beginning, Fred, in a very particular moment in history as it's moving through. And a lot of challenges. I mean, every single day, I actually can't even turn the TV on anymore, right? But I don't want, I've learned, my partner has learned to teaching me to consume news in a very different way, right? But how do we continue to use things like that are core, curiosity, imagination, listening, to navigate? I'm answering the question, but I want to hear your thoughts about it.
And I think that goes back to some of the more fundamental things that I believe, which is that I honestly think we'd be in a better place if we as a collective believed that part of kind of the creative power that we have is to listen, and to listen to many, many different people, and recognize that that's okay. That actually be inspired by complexity, not be destroyed by it, or not be disheartened by it. And I think when things don't mean the one thing, it seems harder. And I think we have to get to a place where we can actually recognize that the bowl you showed means, and what I loved about your photos is that they can mean 10 different things, right? It's like, and then that's okay. And the more we talk about it, the better we can get. The other thing that we believe, and I'll pass it, is I believe that it's always best to kind of try to define your perspective with a story. That it's like that if I say we have the same values, there's just no way to know that. But if we both tell stories, we can understand, does that connect or not? And I think that's one of the most fundamentally human and fundamentally most inspiring things for me, at least in the work that I do.
Yeah.
How do you stay inspired?
Well, you help.
I do.
I think, we talked a little bit about the notion of, I think we're in a very particular moment culturally right now. And one of the things that I feel has happened is we've become quite sort of tribal in our identifications. And that within those tribes, we have very sort of self-described, defined ideas of who we are as groups or individuals or communities, and the way in which we interact with other communities. And so that's caused a lot of tension with politics, but it's caused a lot of tension in other contexts too. So given that, your question of how do you have people go out into the world and have curiosity, another form of this sort of tribalism has been around, I'm going to raise my child to be successful or a lawyer or whatever, and those sort of, in a way, blinders or sort of ways of speeding people up really limit the way in which they think about the world or engage with the world. And what we're missing, to your point exactly, around sort of storytelling and creativity and listening, are the things that we share amongst all of us. And we need to kind of come back to what those are to say, well, it's around compassion, or it's around listening, or it's around sort of slowing down, as opposed to things right now which are it's about speeding up or having more, or about sort of being more efficient. Some of these things that we've sort of chosen to define our society on are probably not super healthy. And we need to kind of rethink what those are, and rethink in ways that we can sort of do incrementally, as opposed to saying we have to have some sort of a revolution or throw all of the stuff out or go backwards in time.
Can I add one thing? Because it's you asked about how we work with companies, and I think it's one of the things that we've grappled with at IDEO, which is that I don't think, so if you think about designing as making something better in the world, that's part of that's what the work is. I don't believe that you can make something better for somebody if, in fact, in some part of you don't love the people you're designing for. And so some of the work that we do with companies is to teach them to fall back in love, or fall in love for the first time with the people that they are supposedly serving. And I know that sounds really crazy and optimistic, but I really feel like to make things and put them in the world for other people, you have to love the people you're doing it for. And so really, it is compassion, and it is love that I think is inspiring, and lets us kind of move forward. Maybe it sounds dorky.
That's
but
a
I think
great
it's real.
way to actually end and resonate out messages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be up here. So
Yeah.